I'd been preparing dinner when Alex arrived home from the army, his footsteps heavy on the porch outside. The door creaked open, and there he was, filling the space with a presence that took my breath away. He wasn't the boy I remembered sending off 2 years ago, all youthful eagerness and lanky limbs. He was a man now, tall, with broad shoulders and an air of quiet authority. His dark eyes scanned the room before settling on me. "Hey, Mom." His voice was deeper, more grounded, and it stirred something in me that I quickly pushed away. "Alex." I set the spatula down, my heart thundering as I stepped forward to embrace him. His arms enveloped me, strong and sure, and for a fleeting moment, I allowed myself to bask in the safety of his hold. The warmth of his body, the scent of fresh air clinging to his clothes, it was intoxicating. I pulled back, looking up at him, my cheeks flushed. "You look good, honey. The army's treated you well." "Yeah." His lips quirked into a faint smile, though his gaze flickered with something unspoken. "It's good to be home." Dan wasn't home yet. Not that it mattered. He'd probably find some excuse to stay out late. He hadn't been mine, not truly, for years. The affair with his young assistant was an open secret in our small town, but we both pretended otherwise. I didn't have the energy to fight anymore. As Alex settled into the house, I watched him from the kitchen. His movements were deliberate, purposeful. There was a gravity to him now, a maturity that made my heart ache with both pride and something more dangerous. He was everything Dan wasn't: disciplined, self-assured, and undeniably masculine. That evening we sat at the dining table, the clatter of cutlery the only sound between us. Alex had always been reserved, but now there was an edge to his silence. I wanted to ask about the war, the things he'd seen, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I studied his face, the sharp angles of his jaw, the shadows playing across his cheekbones. "It's nice having you home," I said finally, breaking the silence. His dark eyes met mine, piercing in their intensity. "I missed you." The simplicity of his words struck me, pulling me under a tide of emotions I hadn't expected. "I missed you too," I whispered. Later, as I cleared the table, he lingered in the doorway, watching me. "Let me help," he said, stepping forward and reaching for the plates. His fingers brushed mine as he took them, the contact sending a jolt through me. I pulled my hand back, flustered. "You don't have to." "I want to," he said firmly, his gaze holding mine. We worked side by side, the intimacy of the moment not lost on me. His presence filled the kitchen, his proximity disarming. I caught myself stealing glances, marveling at the man he'd become. And yet, beneath the admiration, there was an unease, a stirring in my chest that I couldn't name. Or perhaps I could, but refused to. That night, I lay awake in bed, listening to the faint creak of the floorboards as Alex moved through the house. I pictured him in his old room, the bed too small now for his frame. The thought made me smile, but it also brought a pang of longing, sharp and unfamiliar. Dan's absence was a relief. I couldn't bear his cynicism tonight, his dismissive glances and clipped remarks. My marriage had become a hollow shell, a charade of companionship that left me lonely in ways I couldn't articulate. Alex's return had brought light into the cracks of that emptiness, but it also revealed something far more complicated. The next morning I found Alex in the backyard, the rising sun casting a golden hue over his figure as he chopped wood. His movements were fluid, powerful, and my breath caught as I watched him. He noticed me then, straightening and wiping the sweat from his brow. "Good morning," he called, his voice carrying across the stillness. "Morning," I replied, stepping out onto the porch. My heart raced as I approached, and I hated myself for the way my pulse quickened under his gaze. "Need help with anything?" he asked, setting the axe aside. "No, I just wanted to see what you were up to." He nodded, his eyes softening as they held mine. "It's good to be back." The sincerity in his voice undid me. In that moment, I wanted nothing more than to pull him close, to feel the solid weight of him against me and forget, if only for a moment, the emptiness of my life. But I couldn't. I turned away instead, retreating into the house where the walls felt safer, more forgiving. But even there, I couldn't escape the storm brewing inside me. The days that followed felt surreal, as though I were living in a dream I couldn't wake from. Alex's presence filled the house in ways I hadn't anticipated. He wasn't just my son. He had become my confidant, my protector, and something I dared not name. We talked more than we had in years, our conversations slipping into the hours of twilight, long after Dan had retreated into the void of his own life. One evening, after Dan texted that he wouldn't be home again, another late meeting that fooled no one, I decided to make dinner just for the two of us. Cooking had always been my solace, and I poured myself into the meal, crafting something special. Seared salmon with fresh vegetables, the dishes arranged with a care I hadn't indulged in for years. Alex walked into the kitchen as I was setting the table. His hair damp from a shower, wearing a simple t-shirt and jeans that fit him too well. He looked younger and older all at once, the boy I raised and the man he'd become merging into one striking figure. "This looks amazing, Mom," he said, his voice low and warm. He stepped close, peering over my shoulder at the perfectly plated food. "I wanted it to be special," I said, my voice softer than I'd intended. His gaze lingered on me, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. "It is," he said, and I could feel the weight of his words, as though they meant more than just the meal. We ate together in the glow of the dim kitchen lights, the quiet intimacy of the moment wrapping around us like a cocoon. We talked about his time in the army, about the things he'd seen and the friends he'd lost. He opened up in a way that made my heart ache for him, and I found myself reaching across the table to take his hand. "You've been through so much," I murmured, my thumb brushing against the roughness of his knuckles. "But you're here now. You're home." His grip tightened around mine, his eyes dark and searching. "Home feels different now," he said quietly. After dinner, I suggested he let me give him a massage. He had mentioned earlier how sore his shoulders were, and it felt like the least I could do. He hesitated at first, his gaze flicking over me with a mix of surprise and something I couldn't name, but he eventually agreed. "Go sit on the couch," I said, grabbing a bottle of lotion from the cabinet. He sat down, his broad back to me, and pulled his shirt over his head, revealing the muscles that rippled beneath his tanned skin. My breath caught, but I pushed the feeling down, focusing on the task at hand. I rubbed the lotion between my palms and placed my hands on his shoulders, his skin warm under my touch. "You're so tense," I said, kneading the knots beneath my fingers. "I guess I got used to it," he replied, his voice a low rumble. "This is nice." I worked my way down his back, my hands lingering longer than they should have. The room felt heavy with something unspoken, the air thick with tension I didn't know how to disperse. When I finished, I hesitated, my hands still resting on his shoulders. He reached up then, covering one of my hands with his own. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough and low. He turned his head slightly, his dark eyes meeting mine over his shoulder. For a moment we just looked at each other, the silence between us stretching, deepening. And then I leaned forward, unable to stop myself, my lips brushing against his temple in what I told myself was an innocent gesture. But it wasn't. Not really. He turned fully to face me, his expression unreadable, and before I could second-guess myself, I leaned in again, this time pressing my lips to his. The kiss was tentative, hesitant, but it carried a weight that made my chest tighten. When I pulled back, my heart raced, fear and exhilaration mingling in a way that left me breathless. "I'm sorry," I whispered, my voice trembling. But Alex shook his head, his eyes dark and unwavering. "Don't be." He reached for me then, his hand sliding to the nape of my neck as he pulled me closer. His lips found mine again, this time with a confidence that made my knees weak. It wasn't a son's kiss. It was something entirely different, something forbidden. And I couldn't stop myself from responding. When he finally pulled back, his forehead rested against mine, his breath warm against my skin. "I don't know what this is," he said, his voice a mix of confusion and certainty. "But I can't ignore it." Neither could I. There was a magnetism between us, a force that defied logic and propriety. I tried to find the words to make sense of it, to explain it away, but nothing felt adequate. "Alex," I began, my voice trembling, "it's not right." "Maybe not," he said, his eyes searching mine. "But it feels real." I closed my eyes, my heart a storm of guilt and longing. The boundaries between us had blurred beyond recognition, and I didn't know how to find my way back, or if I even wanted to. That night I lay awake, the ghost of his kiss still lingering on my lips. I knew we were treading dangerous ground, but I also knew that something had shifted irreversibly between us. There was no going back now, only forward, into the unknown, into the forbidden. The first snow of the season had fallen the night before, blanketing the world in a pristine white stillness that begged to be admired. Alex suggested we drive to a neighboring town where a frozen lake nestled amidst tall pines. The idea of a winter picnic, just the two of us, was too enticing to refuse. I packed a thermos of hot cocoa and some sandwiches while Alex loaded the truck with blankets and firewood. Watching him move with easy confidence, his broad shoulders wrapped in a flannel jacket, stirred something inside me I couldn't name, or perhaps didn't want to. It was easier to focus on the task at hand, though my hands trembled slightly as I zipped up my coat. The drive was quiet but not uncomfortably so. Snow-dusted trees lined the road, their branches sparkling in the pale winter sunlight. Alex's hand rested on the gearshift, his long fingers tapping idly to the rhythm of the Christmas tune playing softly on the radio. "You okay?" he asked, glancing at me. I nodded, forcing a smile. Just taking it all in. His lips quirked into a half-smile. "Good." When we arrived, the lake was breathtaking. The ice shimmered under the low sun, framed by towering evergreens. We found a secluded spot near the edge, where Alex built a small fire. The crackling flames provided a warm contrast to the crisp, cold air. Sitting on the blanket beside him, sipping hot cocoa, I let myself relax in a way I hadn't in years. There was something about being out here, away from the house, away from Dan, that made everything feel simpler, easier. "I've missed this," I said, staring out at the frozen lake. Being out in nature. I shook my head, my gaze dropping to my gloved hands. "Whoa." Feeling alive. He didn't respond right away, but I could feel his eyes on me, heavy with questions he didn't ask. After a long silence, he spoke. "You deserve to feel that way all the time, Mom." The words brought a lump to my throat. I bit my lip, trying to keep my emotions in check, but they spilled over anyway. "It's been so hard, Alex," I said, my voice breaking. "Living with Dan. Knowing he doesn't care anymore. That he's with someone else." Alex's jaw tightened, his hands balling into fists. "Why do you stay? You don't have to put up with that." "It's not that simple," I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it anymore. "Yeah, it is," he said firmly. "You don't deserve to be treated like that. If you leave him, I'll take care of you. You don't need him." The conviction in his voice took my breath away. I turned to him, my eyes searching his face. "You don't mean that." "I do," he said, his tone leaving no room for doubt. "You've spent your whole life taking care of everyone else. Let me take care of you." My heart ached at his words, at the raw sincerity in his eyes. I wanted to believe him, to lean into the promise of his protection, but the voice in my head screamed that it wasn't right, that I couldn't let him carry that burden. "I don't know," I whispered. He reached for my hand, his grip warm and steady. "You don't have to decide now. Just think about it." I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. The fire crackled between us, its warmth a pale reflection of the heat growing inside me. I couldn't stop staring at him, couldn't ignore the way his presence made me feel safe and cherished in a way I hadn't felt in years. When the sun dipped below the horizon, we packed up and headed home. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink, the snow-covered world glowing in the fading light. As we drove, the truck's heater hummed softly, filling the cab with a comfortable warmth. "Let's stop for a minute," Alex said suddenly, pulling over to the side of the road. We stepped out into the crisp evening air, the silence around us broken only by the distant hoot of an owl. He led me to a small clearing where the snow sparkled under the moonlight. Felt like we were the only two people in the world. "Beautiful, isn't it?" he said, his breath visible in the cold air. I nodded, though I wasn't looking at the scenery. My eyes were on him, on the way the moonlight softened his features, casting shadows that made him look both rugged and gentle. He turned to me then, his gaze intense. "Mom," he hesitated, his hand reaching out to tuck a stray strand of hair behind my ear. His touch lingered, and I felt my breath catch. I should have stepped back, should have said something to break the spell, but I didn't. Couldn't. "Alex," I murmured, my voice barely audible. He stepped closer, his hand sliding to the back of my neck. "I can't pretend anymore," he said, his voice low and raw. "I care about you more than I should." Before I could respond, his lips found mine. The kiss was tentative at first, as though he was waiting for me to pull away. But I didn't. I leaned into him, my hands clutching his jacket as his arms wrapped around me, pulling me close. The world around us faded, the cold forgotten in the warmth of his embrace. The kiss deepened, filled with an urgency that left me breathless. When we finally broke apart, our foreheads rested together, our breaths mingling in the frigid air. "I don't know what this is," I whispered. "Neither do I," he admitted. "But I know it feels right." I closed my eyes, tears slipping down my cheeks. Everything about this was wrong, but in that moment I didn't care. All I knew was that I felt alive, truly alive, for the first time in years. The day I told Dan I wanted a divorce felt like stepping off the edge of a cliff. His reaction was as indifferent as I'd feared it would be. He didn't argue or beg, didn't even seem surprised. Instead, he nodded, muttering something about it being for the best, before retreating back into his phone, likely texting the woman who had already replaced me in his life. The lack of fight stung more than I expected, but it also reaffirmed what I already knew. My marriage had been over for a long time. The paperwork was filed quickly, and within weeks I was free, not just from Dan, but from the weight of pretending to be happy. Alex was there every step of the way. He handled the logistics I couldn't bear to face, from sorting through old documents to arranging movers. His steady presence kept me grounded, his quiet encouragement a balm for the wounds left by years of neglect. When the divorce was finalized, I found him waiting for me outside the courthouse. He pulled me into a hug, his arms strong and sure around me. "It's done," I whispered, my voice trembling. He pulled back, his hands resting on my shoulders as he looked down at me. "You did it. You're free now. Free." The word echoed in my mind, filling the spaces that had been occupied by fear and doubt. For the first time in years I felt light, unburdened. "I couldn't have done it without you," I said, my voice thick with emotion. He smiled, that rare, genuine smile that lit up his whole face. "You don't have to do anything alone anymore." The move to a new city was Alex's idea. A fresh start, he called it, and I couldn't argue. The small town where everyone knew everyone, and where Dan's betrayal had become a topic of whispered gossip, held no appeal for me anymore. Alex found us a modest house on the outskirts of a bustling city, its tall windows letting in endless light and its small garden promising a space for me to breathe. The first few weeks were a whirlwind of unpacking and adjusting to our new surroundings. Alex found a job quickly, working in construction, while I took my time settling in, finding solace in the quiet mornings when the house was empty and the world seemed to pause. But the nights were ours. Behind closed doors, our connection deepened in ways that felt both thrilling and terrifying. We shared everything, our fears, our dreams, the little moments that made us laugh and the ones that left us quiet with thought. In his arms, I found a safety I hadn't known I needed. With him, I wasn't just Ruth the mother or Ruth the ex-wife. I was Ruth, a woman rediscovering what it meant to feel alive. One evening, as we sat on the couch with the faint hum of the city outside, Alex reached for my hand. His thumb brushed over my knuckles, a small, grounding gesture that sent warmth coursing through me. "Are you happy?" he asked, his voice soft. I turned to him, my heart swelling at the sight of him. This man who had given me so much, who had become my everything. "I am," I said honestly. "For the first time in a long time." He smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners in a way that made my chest ache. "Good. Because I am too." Life in the new city became a rhythm that was uniquely ours. We cooked together, explored the parks and museums, and spent lazy Sundays in bed, talking about everything and nothing. The house was filled with laughter, music, and a sense of warmth I hadn't realized I'd been missing. But we were careful. In public, we kept our relationship carefully veiled, maintaining the illusion of a mother and son building a new life after a difficult chapter. It wasn't always easy, but the love we shared behind closed doors made it worth the effort. One evening, as we sat on the back porch watching the stars, Alex wrapped a blanket around my shoulders and pulled me close. The night was cool, the air carrying the faint scent of blooming flowers. "Do you ever think about the future?" he asked, his voice low. "All the time," I replied. "But it's hard to picture sometimes." He tilted his head, his gaze steady. "Picture us. Just us. Living life on our terms, no matter what anyone thinks." His words wrapped around me like the blanket, warm and reassuring. "That sounds perfect." He leaned down, pressing a kiss to my forehead before resting his chin on top of my head. "We'll make it perfect. Together." As the seasons changed, so did we. Our lives became intertwined in ways that felt as natural as breathing. We celebrated holidays with quiet dinners for two, exchanged small, thoughtful gifts that spoke to how deeply we knew each other, and made plans for the future that once seemed impossible. There were challenges, of course. The secrecy, the fear of being discovered, the whispers of doubt that occasionally crept in. But every time those shadows threatened to overtake me, Alex was there, pulling me back into the light. "You're my everything," he told me one night as we lay tangled together, the city's lights casting a faint glow through the window. "I don't care what the world thinks. You're all I need." I pressed my forehead to his, tears slipping down my cheeks. "And you're mine." In his arms, the rest of the world faded away. There was only us, our love, our life, our promise to build a future on our own terms. And in that moment, I knew we'd found something rare, something beautiful, something worth fighting for. The path we'd chosen wasn't easy, but it was ours. And as I drifted off to sleep, my heart full and my soul at peace, I knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, we'd face them together. Because in Alex, I'd found not just a partner, but a home. And for the first time in my life, I felt truly, completely free.